Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode in store for you. We're going to be talking all about loading tools. There are a million different variations of most exercises out there nowadays. Even just in squatting, there's about 20 different ways you could load it up, at least, probably a lot more if we listed them all out. So we're going to discuss the pros and cons of different loading options and most importantly, the principles behind them. So you can intelligently select which one you're using to achieve your desired stimulus. Before we get into it, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. We've just upgraded the movement mechanics mentorship. So if you're a coach, PT, or healthcare professional looking to get a next level understanding of how the body moves and learn a detailed assessment protocol, please check out the website for more information. Also, thank you to wit-fitness.com. For all your WIT kit, please use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hytro, for any blood flow restriction apparel, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off. Right, let's get into it.
Yeah, mate. When you proposed this episode to me, the main thing I thought about was I kind of got transported back to about 2013, 2014, my bodybuilding days. And I just thought, I used to do so many different variations of the exact same thing. And I thought it was really interesting because obviously back then I was doing it for a completely different reason. But also I didn't have as much of an education. I thought, okay, I'm doing these movements because I need to challenge the, say, shoulders. So I'd use dumbbell shoulder presses, I'll be doing strict presses, I'll be using cables, I'll be using machines. And they were obviously structured in such a way to give me the desired stimulus that I was after at the time. But now when I look back, I do think, I wonder how structured I wasn't, because I don't have that stuff written down anymore. I didn't keep all my training notes. But I wonder if I was doing it in such a way, which now that when we, like, for things that we're going to discuss today, I wonder if I was taking that in indirectly without thinking about it.
I think bodybuilders are actually really good at this in terms like the sort of bro logic behind it is you do all the different variations, so you target all the different fibers of the muscle. So if you're trying to grow your shoulders or your chest completely, that's why you'd use all the different angles and all the different machines and bits of kit to just target every possible part of a muscle, because obviously their goal is hypertrophy and building nice looking full complete musculature. And there's definitely an element of truth into that, and I think they have figured out a lot of this for that reason. But what I want to talk about today is how do you figure out which variations are most appropriate for what you want in your training. Because yeah, just preparing for the episode, I was thinking about squats and how you could potentially load squats differently. And there, I'm going to give like a partial list here where there's stuff all the way from leg pressing, front squat, back squat, overhead squat, loading with dumbbells, kettlebells, double dumbbell kettlebell, mixed racks, goblet squats, safety squats, hack squats, searcher squats, squats with reaches, like leaning forward, back, up, down, left, right, rotating all the same. You can load squats with belts, with cables, with bands. And there's even that squat stick thing that's a bit like a shake weight that people squat down and up on. Like,
Yeah.
so there's so many different ways you can load that one movement pattern. How do you make an intelligent decision about which one is appropriate for what you're trying to get to, and what distinguishes one from another? Like, what is actually the difference between a single arm dumbbell overhead squat versus a leg press? Like, what are the movement quality categories that actually distinguish them? And yeah, I think it's very niche as a topic, but actually something that's worth investigating, because if we can leverage that knowledge to our advantage, there's actually some gains on the table to be grabbed.
Yeah, I think why I also really like this is because especially with social media and you see a lot of these variations, because sometimes the more obscure they are, the better they're going to do, right? So you do see some obscure stuff, and sometimes they might you might see something and think, is this just stupid, or what are they actually challenging at? What is the purpose? And that's why when again you said about this episode, I thought it's quite a cool one, because of it might help people identify what they see on social media and actually say, okay, this isn't just for, it probably is also for shits and giggles, but also it gives people a think of, actually that might be a slightly different version of that, might actually be really good for what I'm trying to target, because I'm just not finding my quads in the squat at the moment. I'm not finding my hamstrings in my deadlift or whatever it is. And
Mm,
so this could be a really cool way to kind of maybe help you as a listener get an understanding of kind of what you see out there and also
mm.
what you might already know and think, I can maybe make a little bit of a better decision. So I guess one of the things we probably like to start with is what are some of the principles behind all the different loading tools, because there are so many.
Yeah, I think if we think about the variables that we can play with to our advantage, one of the key variables for all these different loading options would be the manipulation of stability. Like, depending on how we load a movement, we can add more or less stability depending on what we want to train or develop. So, at its simplest, single arm, single leg variations will be less stable, and double arm, double leg, or bilateral versions will be more stable. We can get even more stability by adding an extra point of contact, so having both hands and one foot, or both feet and one hands, or even more stability by using cables or machines. So we've got extra points of contact. So the principle here is the more points of contact you have, and the more like stable and rigid they are, the easier it is to generate force. And this is one of the reasons why you can leg press more than you can squat, because the demand for stability is very, very low. So you can actually use a higher percentage of your potential strength because none of it is being used to stabilize the movement. And that has pros and cons in that you can potentially put more force through a target muscle, which is why bodybuilders really like machines. So they can isolate a given muscle or muscle group and force it to grow more. But the con would be that you're not using your body in proportion, and you're actually developing strength that you can't stabilize, because those primary prime movers are learning to develop huge amounts of force without the need to stabilize them. So if they generate that force in an unstable environment, it's
Yeah.
potentially uncontrolled and can go wayward and take you off the optimal movement pattern.
This just made me think of an exercise as like, like a sled. And I'm thinking a lot of
Yep.
the time people start really close up, using as much of their body as possible. So using the power of the legs, that just reminds me of like a leg press. So you're
Mm-hmm.
using that leg press, and then you get to the point where you get really tired. Those arms go out straight, and your head's down. You're just like, what can I do to just try and then keep it as long? So I'm not holding on to the weight. I'm kind of doing it through my joints and kind of pushing through the legs. So then I'm trying to create more stability rather than having that. And it was just funny because that's a functional exercise, and just then taking it into then going from a essentially like in a bodybuilder's slash like different mindset of way of doing it, and like why people execute it. And like, because I know when I'm using the sled and I'm trying to push maximally, or like I'm trying to push anything, could be a car, I'm going to be quite close up to it to start with until I have to, and then essentially get it away from me to then use more of my joints and stability to kind of keep it moving.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that it is sort of multifactorial in that it's not just stability that affects the difficulty of an exercise. The physics and the leverage involved and stuff like bar path will massively affect the difficulty of an exercise. So that leads us nicely onto the next topic, which is basically leverage. And for all these different movement variations, something that we need to consider is how close is the weight to our body, because the further away from our body the weight is, the more difficult it's going to feel. So the classic example here is if you hold a dumbbell at your shoulder, it's relatively easy. If you hold it at arm's length, it feels a lot heavier because the lever arm is longer. And we can use this to our advantage again, in that using a weight that's further away can tax us more, so we can actually get a training stimulus with less load. And if we're smart about how we set exercises up and where we position the weights, that's a potential option for creating a stronger stimulus in a given muscle while using less weight. We need to consider the opposite, though. If our goal is performance, then we want those lever arms to be as short as possible, or zero. And we talk about this in our deadlift and our squat deep dive episodes. When we talk about bar path, we want that to be as close to vertical as possible, so that there is as little leverage as possible if we want to shift the maximum weight. So, as we always say, it comes back to being very clear on what you're trying to get out of an exercise. Like, if you're trying to pull the heaviest deadlift, you want a vertical bar path, but say, for example, you're trying to emphasize hamstring recruitment and use of the posterior chain, doing a dumbbell deadlift with a forward reach and throwing your hands as far forwards as you can in front of your feet so that your hips have to go very far behind your feet, you're actually going to get a really strong load through the hamstrings. And even though it's not optimal deadlift mechanics for performance, for the goal of improving posterior chain recruitment, that is a great exercise in our deadlift download at lungeandlift.com for those interested. But one point that I think is really important to express here is that muscles don't know what's on the bar. They don't know how much weight you're holding. All muscles know is their experience, which is essentially how much tension is going through them and how much work they as individual motor units and muscle groups have to do. So for that hamstring, if you're holding two 10-kilo dumbbells and reaching really far forwards, it might actually experience more tension than if you're doing a 50-kilo deadlift from the floor with a barbell. So
Yeah.
there's less than half the weight, but in terms of actual tension going through the muscle, which is the stimulus for that muscle to get stronger, it can have a greater experience with less weight. So I think a lot of people poo-poo exercises where you're not lifting loads and loads of mass, but actually in terms of how hard you're working, it can be really surprising if you find the right loading tool, the right angles and the right variations, that you can actually get a stronger workout for your specific training stimulus.
Yeah, but that's just breaking the norm, mate. No one wants to see a 10-kilo reach. They want to see a 200
I know.
kilo deadlift, right?
That's
That's
right.
the
Yeah.
thing. And it's because then, and this is the funny thing about it, because then people would then see that 10-kilo deadlift and say, oh, that's just a load of hoo-ha. That's just a load of shit. They don't know what they're doing. They're doing this for Instagram. It's stupid. And it's like, whereas actually it's probably vice versa, because it's the 200-kilo deadlift person, which is just about getting up off the floor, really pushing it, just because they want that Instagram video. So it's funny because so then a question to you, because in my head, using my sled example, the longer the lever, the easier I'm making it. Because so then technically so then like when we said the dumbbell further away, it make it harder for me. Say just using the sled, if I'm close to it, obviously it's the easiest because I'm able to use maximum force and strength that I can to produce the power. But then when I'm getting tired, I'm creating a longer lever so I can use less muscle and use more joints going through.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So this is why I was saying it's multifactorial in that it's not just any one of these principles.
Yeah.
They're all at play all the time. So by locking out your elbows and shoulders, you're creating more stability. You're also, if your shoulders are getting fatigued in that sort of front rack essentially position
Yeah.
when you're driving, that could be the limiter as to you pushing the sled even further. So by going into the lockout position, provided you've got a good lockout, you can take them out as a potential limiter for driving the sled further. So there are caveats and nuances
Yeah.
around these principles, but what I want to do is sort of highlight them as topics to be aware of, so you can manipulate them to your advantage when
Yeah.
appropriate.
Because that's kind of why I wanted to bring that bit up, because like obviously there where we spoke about with the leverage, saying the longer the lever, the heavier it feels. It's like that is obviously true most of the time, and this is where agency comes in, and you have to start to look, when you are looking at something, you have to try and get as close to an understanding of what you're trying to get out of something, not just doing something for something's sake and saying, right, I'm going to put what I've learned in this lunge and lift episode into play and try and just taking that leverage, longer the lever, the heavier it feels, and not then knowing more about it or understand it. So this is where we obviously do have to start to really understand the purpose of the overload that we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the other example of that would be with bar path in a squat, for example, where somebody, when they're maxing out, the bar bumps forwards and goes away from over the feet, which is a longer lever, but because of their individual mechanics, they can stand the way up like that because they don't have the mechanics or skill or experience to keep the bar in the right plane. Long term, if they learnt the skill to keep the bar over their feet in a nice vertical bar path, they would definitely be able to lift more, because biomechanically, from a physics point of view, it is easier. But for right now, their body's movement mechanics limiter means that the only way they can create the force to get up is by leaning forwards, probably to get more posterior chain recruitment because they maybe don't have strong enough quads or anterior chain, whatever it might be. But in that person, in that moment in time, it feels easier because their individual set of circumstances means that it's worth having less favorable leverage to get better recruitment of the muscles that they're strong in. But if you go towards elite performance and you're trying to squeeze out every bit of advantage you can, the leverage would have to be reduced because you having that bump forwards, you can get away with it at an amateur level. But if you're looking to go to the very top, everyone's got the perfect or near
Yeah.
perfect bar path, because if you're fighting physics as well as the weight of the bar, you're putting yourself at a massive disadvantage.
Yeah. So obviously we've covered some of the principles so far: stability and leverage. So now I guess coming on to maybe our last point of tension. I think this is a really cool one because within the CrossFit sphere, within the functional fitness sphere, that tension was something which kind of completely got forgotten about in a way, because it was all about like speed of things, making things efficient, and not maintaining tension necessarily through a movement per se in a traditional sense, like say a bodybuilding sense. Now with when we obviously relate back to our previous episode, dysfunctional bodybuilding, and we start talking about the fact that there's more bodybuilding being introduced within the functional fitness sphere, doing a lot more tempo work and using cables, using bands and stuff like that to get more of a the desired training stimulus that they're after. I think tension is quite a cool principle to maybe dive into a bit more here.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a really good point because in performance and in sport, we're actually trying to reduce tension because tension is work. We have limited work capacity. So if we can do the same exercise to the necessary movement standard with less tension, we're saving energy and we're able to perform at a higher level. However, if you're looking to grow a muscle, you're trying to build some tissue, you need time under tension. So we're actually looking to increase the tension going through a muscle. And a classic example of this would be butterfly or kipping pull-ups. You're trying to get your chin over or your chest to the bar. If you're doing it for performance, with as little tension as possible. If you're doing it for hypertrophy, with as much tension as possible. So you're actually trying to do almost the fewest reps you can by making the exercise as hard as possible if you're a bodybuilder. That's why you might weight it. That's why you use tempo, you use pauses. You're actually reducing your performance because it has a stronger stimulus on the body to grow. Whereas if you're doing it in CrossFit for performance, you're trying to make it as easy as possible so you can knock out as many reps as you can. So having a clear understanding on exactly why you're using the exercise will dictate which approach is most appropriate for you. And you can get better results with every rep that you choose to do. So I think in terms of tension on a muscle, when we look at different loading tools, obviously weights like barbells and dumbbells, they push down constantly. They work with gravity and they'll always push down. They're never going to be expressing gravity in another direction, but straight through.
No.
So,
I'm just
we need to
picturing
bear
this
that
bouncing dumbbell now. Like the shake weight.
Yeah, exactly. So that means the force they express on the body will always be down, and if it's away from the body, it's still down. So that's where it comes into play with leverage. So if it's pressing down away from the body, it might change which muscle groups it taxes and also the amount of difficulty depending on that lever arm. Things like cables, they obviously pull towards the attachment, so we can manipulate the direction of gravity by using pulleys to change that angle. This gives us the advantage of challenging different muscles in the body that wouldn't necessarily be taxed so much through gravity naturally. But the tension is constant in terms of the tension going through the handle, not necessarily
Yeah.
through the muscle, which we'll come on to shortly. And the other key example, I think, is bands. In a band, the rubber band obviously is expressing most force when it's long. So as you lengthen a band through an exercise, it gets progressively harder towards its maximum stretch. And obviously, when it's got zero stretch, it's not producing or not providing any challenge or resistance. So knowing when you want to challenge the muscle in the movement will dictate which loading tool is most appropriate for your training stimulus.
Yeah, this is where things like bands and cables for me are an awesome awesome tool to use when trying to help people find muscles, and when they're just not quite, like, say if you're trying to fill your chest doing, say, some cable flies compared to, say, doing dumbbell flies, people can start to really get a greater understanding, because the tension going through the muscle is so much greater, and you can really start to get a pump, basically. And that's the thing. So creating that tension and getting a pump in the desired muscle can really start to help you gain a better understanding of what that muscle feels like to contract and so forth. Now, that's not really necessarily going to improve performance per se, but as a gaining a better understanding of your body, that in turn can then help with performance. And that's where, because for me, when from previous clients and stuff, like, their goal isn't necessarily, say, a bodybuilding goal, but they probably want to look better most of the time. But for people that have just zero awareness of their body, it can really start to help when they start to feel certain muscles moving, especially their back and stuff, because there's only so much you can, say, verbally cue and like touch them and so forth through certain things. But if I start to say, okay, say squeeze your lats, so I say, cool, okay, contract, imagine you're carrying a newspaper under your armpit type thing. So I'm giving them an external kind of thought process, but with a cable, they can kind of do that together. So they can think about that newspaper while pulling and getting their lats to contract. Now, I know when we spoke about, like, with the dysfunctional bodybuilding, like, does that really carry over to things like pull-ups and so forth? But if they start to have a greater understanding of what their lats feel like, what their scapula feels like to move, that can then in turn help with things like pull-ups, because then we start, say, doing scapular pull-ups. They start to understand what it feels like to actually move the scapula independently compared to just as a global movement.
Yeah, a few good things in there, and
just a few, mate.
Just a few, yeah, not too many. A few. I think the thing I like in that most was in teaching movement mechanics. One of the big principles is that we want movement to be subconscious for it to be efficient. However, if somebody has an imbalance or some sort of dysfunction where certain muscle groups are not firing, we need to do something to teach the body to fire them better and in the pattern that matters. So that's a classic example of people not able to use their lats in the pull-up, and choosing a different loading tool or choosing a different variation is the most effective way to get them to use the muscle. And if we're smart enough with our setup, we can force the muscle to fire because of the angle, because of the variation and difficulty, or the moment in the exercise where it's hardest, because the body will have no other option than to use the target muscle. So the applications can be for bodybuilding and building like a strong mind-muscle connection to target a muscle that they struggle to find. But it can also be in a subconscious repatterning sense, that if we use a certain variation or a certain loading tool, the body has no other option but to fire the muscle we want better and subconsciously, which is, from a performance perspective, far more powerful, because in the speed of sport, you're not able to consciously contract muscles. Your body just does. And I think everybody intuitively knows this. At the end of a CrossFit workout or the end of a game of sport, when you're blowing out your ass, you're not individually firing muscles. You're not thinking about squeezing your glutes. You're not thinking about firing your lats. You're just thinking about the task of, like, get your chest to the bar or pull it off the floor, stand it up. And that is more efficient. That is more effective. The subconscious has much better capacity to coordinate and sequence our muscles than our conscious mind does, which is ultimately where we want to get to. But in the process of reprogramming a movement pattern, there are cases where we can play with the approach to learn a new skill to fire these muscles. And that's where those variations can really come in handy.
Nice. So I guess that also then takes into consideration when we're using these different tools for different tension, is in where at what point is it toughest, or where are you the strongest? Just like we discussed earlier with leverage and stuff, and also like using dumbbells and cables, like they all have different stimuli. So then what is the best way to kind of get the most tension out of something?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the key concepts here, the difference between a resistance profile and the strength profile. So a resistance profile is basically where in the movement is it most difficult, and the strength profile is where in the movement can you create most force or are you strongest. And depending on the variations you choose, they can be well matched or not well matched. And depending on what you want out of the exercise, what part of the movement you want to challenge, it can mean different variations are more or less appropriate. The classic example here is banded pull-ups. In that, in a banded pull-up, if your feet are in the band's on the bar itself. When you're at the very bottom, the band has got most stretch, so it's giving you the most assistance. And when you're at the top, the band might have little to no stretch, so it's giving you the least assistance. So if your struggle point in the pull-up is actually getting your chin over bar, then actually you're getting the least assistance in the part that you need the most assistance. So you're removing the training stimulus at the bottom, where you could potentially do the bottom half of the pull-up unassisted, but you're getting the most assistance. And the top half of the pull-up, which you're struggling with, you're getting no assistance. So the only way you're going to get through that is using speed and momentum from the band, which isn't wrong, but in terms of developing a more even strength profile through the pull-up,
Yeah.
it's not really a very targeted way of going about it. This is where options like assisted pull-ups can be more effective, because if you're a good spotter, you give just the right amount of assistance to help somebody through their sticking points, and so they're working as hard as they can through the tough parts, and you might give them little to no assistance in the easier parts. So we're always trying to decide, what do we actually want out of this exercise? If we're trying to develop even pulling strength through the whole movement, then maybe bands aren't the right option. But if we're just trying to practice the movement pattern and positions that we'll find ourselves in, using a bit of speed and momentum and a bounce out of the band is actually a fine option. And plenty of people have made plenty of progress using banded pull-ups.
Yeah, I mean, I do like banded pull-ups, but I generally, for most of my clientele and stuff, I generally kind of err closer to like self-assisted or that kind of option where you're using your own feet or knees or whatever to finish the movement. However, I like to assist when I really need to know how much assistance they're getting, because them using their feet to get themselves up and they're saying they're only using say 20% and they're actually using 50% is a really hard measure, because unless I've got a force plate for them to be standing on to kind of be getting some readings, which I do not, it can be hit and miss, which is why I like say the feet up on a box option for a pull-up. Because when your feet are flat on a box, yes, you can drive down into those heels. But if you drive down into heels, your hips come up. So you can then get a telltale. So as a coach, you can kind of see how much they're helping themselves through the box. So I think, as I say, bands are a nice way to help. But for most people where they struggle from that say the last third of a pull-up, I definitely kind of lean more towards the self-assisted / assisted pull-up options to kind of help with that strength curve.
Yeah, spot on. And I think the other classic example that's worth talking about is stuff like lateral raises, where if you're using a dumbbell, when the dumbbell's at your side, it's not challenging your delt at all. And when your arm is horizontal, then obviously the lever arm is longest, so there's a huge amount of challenge. So basically, as you move towards that horizontal position, it gets harder, and closer to your side, there's very little resistance. So if we're trying to challenge that muscle through its fullest range of motion, we're using a highly variable load. Even though the dumbbell is the same weight, the actual challenge to the muscle changes massively, and there's probably a small slither of that range of motion where the challenge is appropriate to your muscle's capacity. So if we're trying to build muscle and looking for hypertrophy, trying to get a good amount of time under tension at a good level of challenge, this is where stuff like cables might be more appropriate, because if we have the right angle of the cable, we can challenge the muscle through a greater range of motion, which will give it a better hypertrophic response. But as we said earlier, that's for hypertrophy, not a performance reason.
Yeah, because the thing is that when I think about lateral raise, and so any bro or broette has done where you hold onto a cable stack and you put your feet right next to it and lean away from it, so that weight is pulling across your body, so you're creating a longer lever for it to kind of work its way through. That is such a pump. And like,
Yeah.
but then when you use dumbbells, and anyone that's done, again, probably bros and broettes, where they've done their run the racks, where you start with heavy dumbbells or lateral raises, and you run the way right down to your light dumbbells until you can barely get them off your side. I mean, that has some play as well. You know, I definitely can say like my shoulders have been absolutely smoked by using dumbbells, but I think what is a really interesting thing is, you know, what you mentioned there, how you're using, say, a 10 kilo dumbbell, but 10 kilos by your side compared to 10 kilos out horizontally is two different loadings. And like how, even though it's the same weight, it's going to change you in such a different way that if really the challenge point comes from, say, 45 degrees to 90 degrees, that's the range where you want to be playing around in to get the most hypertrophy from it. So
Yeah, exactly. But then, like you said, you're training it in a partial range, which
yeah,
is why that side leaning cable variation, the muscle is challenged from nearly its longest state
Yep.
to close to its shortest state. So in terms of the range of motion that's getting challenged, it's much more effective. And yeah, I think that's an important thing to consider if you're looking to grow some muscle.
So I guess a lot of this also comes down to how do we know which is best to use for ourselves in our training or for our clientele if we've got some clients. And we know there are so many options of exercises out there. And as we've discussed through stability, leverage, and tension, there are many different principles from the loading tools. What are some of the ways that we can kind of extract some of this to give the best to our clients and ourselves?
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is that technically you can load any muscle with any tool if you're creative enough and you know what you're doing from a anatomical point of view. But what we really want to focus on, like what's optimal for our clients' goals or our own goals, and what's actually practical. So the principles behind choosing a loading tool are we want to challenge the target muscles or the target movement pattern in a way that's going to move them towards their goals as effectively as possible. So if it is hypertrophy, we've done a whole deep dive episode on the principles of hypertrophy. We want to focus on time under tension, metabolic stress, help me out here, time under tension, metabolic stress, mechanical tension as well. So the muscle effectively is working as hard as possible. So however we load the body, whichever muscles we're trying to grow, they need to be doing the majority of the work, and they want to be doing it through as great a range of motion as possible. If we're looking to challenge a motor pattern and improve our performance, then obviously we're going to optimize for the amount of load or the amount of reps they can do. So using a variation that allows this will have greater carryover to their strength or performance. So it is very much an open-ended question depending on what the individual wants. But I think for me, the key takeaways I want for this episode are that depending on the loading tool and setup and placement of our body and bit of kit, this massively can affect the training stimulus on the body in terms of the muscles used, the difficulty, and the actual stimulus, whether it's for performance or for hypertrophy. The other key thing is that muscles don't know what's on the bar. So what we want to focus on is their individual experience. If we're looking for hypertrophy, how is that muscle actually being affected through the movement? How much tension is going through the target muscle? Because you can have a heavy weight on the bar, but the target muscle is not actually lifting any of it. You're not getting the training stimulus that you want. And I think squat variations are probably the biggest example of this, in that if somebody's trying to grow their quads and they're doing a back squat and their quads get absolutely no stimulus, that's not going to happen. So choosing a different variation, elevating heels, using front squats, whatever it might be, you're going to get much better results from a different loading tool or position.
Yeah, just like for me, like when I do a low bar back squat compared to a high bar back squat, so just that position, I'm using a lot less quads. And I know just from my own weaknesses, because I know as soon as I do, say, a high bar, say, heel elevated squat, how much I struggle with just that. So it's how much posterior chain that I use. Hence why, again, a deadlift, I much prefer a deadlift to a squat. But that's why I low bar squat, to try and keep it as posterior as possible. So that's in that loading of where I'm placing the bar. So the leverage is slightly different. So, you know, and that was, I think, a really key thing for me when I think about the movement side of things, is we're trying to always, the practical side of things. I'm always trying to make it as easy as possible for myself because I'm trying to say train for the sport of performance for me, say with powerlifting. So that I'm always trying to think of that. But is it necessarily optimal for my body? Definitely not. So
That's a really nice example, actually, because we can think of what's the training stimulus that we're trying to get from your loading tool or exercise selection. And if we're trying to optimize for performance and lifting the heaviest weight possible, you'd obviously go low bar back squat. Whereas if we're trying to optimize for developing your quads, if we've identified that as a limiter to your squat performance, then we would change the setup. So it might be heel elevated front squat or high bar to shift emphasis to overload the quads. So the quads get stronger because in your back squat, you use the posterior chain so much, you might not actually be challenging your quads for them to get stronger. So using less weight with a different loading tool, different setup to challenge your quads more might result in better performance long term because we're actually able to address your limiter. But if you just kept hammering back low bar back squats, the quads would never get enough stimulation to perform at a level comparable to your posterior chain. So that illustrates really nicely how we can play with different exercise selection and setups.
it's exactly because at the second part of my week, so at the start of the week, I do my performance of a low bar back squat. But the second part of my week, I have at the moment, because I'm about 15, 16 weeks out from my competition, I've still got a squat variation to target a weakness of mine. And for me, I've chosen basically cyclist squats, so high bar cyclist squats, because I know my quad strength is probably the weaker portion of the squat itself. Because when I squat, I notice a lot of the time my knees do want to shoot back slightly. So I'm trying to shift into my posterior chain to then finish off the movement. So I'm actively, and because again, I wear Converse, so flat footed mostly rather than in, say, weightlifting shoes. So I'm quite flat footed. So everything's coming to the posterior as much as possible. So I'm trying to now enable myself to say a little bit more quad loaded to enable me to use more muscle to move more weight, rather than always relying upon my posterior chain to do the job, because I've got to save that posterior chain for the deadlift. Because, and I always know this, because even just from both my competitions that I've done, I've had to wear a belt going into my bench press because my left lower back starts to tweak up after a heavy back squat because I've loaded too much into my back compared to, say, keeping myself a little bit, say, more vertical and having a little bit more quad in my squat. So
Yeah, spot on. So I think the next takeaway I want everyone to leave with is using physics to our advantage. So depending on what we're trying to get out of the body, changing the amount of stability, changing the lever length can massively affect how we drive adaptation in the body. And at its simplest, using unstable loading tools will teach the body the skill of stability because it's going to overload the body's ability to control the loading tool.
we need to bring the Bosu balls back out, do we?
Yeah, get the Bosu balls
Right,
out
cool.
and the shake weights on the Bosu balls. And using a more stable loading tool allows for easier muscular overload. So if hypertrophy is what you're after, this is the argument for using the cables, using the machines, because it's going to be much easier to overload an individual muscle in that situation because neighboring muscles are less able to get involved and help get the job done.
Nice. Love that, mate. So we really hope you pulled some really cool points out of today's episode and you're able to maybe think about ways that you can start to maybe intensify your training in different ways to target muscles and movement patterns in a slightly different way. So if you did enjoy today's episode, please do share it, leave a review. We would love to keep reading those reviews. We really appreciate it. If you do want to support the podcast, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe completely free of charge. And it does help us grow a little bit more. But as always, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate you tuning in every week and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.